Thank you for thank you, Kim, for being willing to tackle this and to open up this conversation with us.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Kim, and my pronouns are she, her. This is Kevin, his pronouns are he, him, and we are on the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun and the Ta'an Quitchin people in the Yukon. Back in August of 2021, when Kevin and I were looking for a church that was more in line with our affirming justice forward theology, as many others, we Googled Vancouver churches evangelical affirming. And found the Open Way website and looked through the materials, and particularly the Belonging Handbook, which's name itself is a great start. And I was immediately attracted to the shared practice of unlikely friendship. My common experience in the church had been a social structure that avoided if not discouraged these types of friendships. People were put into groups, children, youth, men, women, marrieds, the dreaded singles, didn't want to be one of them, families, seniors, and that was where you were expected to find your social connections. And following that model, I would have thought of an affirming church would then just have a group for the lesbians and the gay men and the non-binary folk and the trans folk, etc. There'd be all the little groups consistent with some of my prior experience. And I found the notion of a church that valued and actively promoted friendships across these sorts of boundaries to be refreshing and compelling. And I was thrilled to be given the opportunity to speak about it in our shared practice series. And the scriptural foundation, because I felt it slide towards self-help, and I wanted a scriptural foundation. The one that I found most compelling was looking at the sort of people that Jesus called to be close to him. And we see this from the very start of Jesus' ministry, and it even continues after he has ascended back to God. So Kevin has offered to do my readings, which will be interspersed through the sermon.
Matthew 4:12, 13, and 17. Now, hearing that John had been handed over, Jesus withdrew into Galilee. And departing from Nazareth, he came and took up his dwelling in Capernaum, near beside the sea, in the territories of Zebulun and Naphtali. From that time, Jesus began to make his proclamation and to say, "Change your hearts, for the kingdom of the heavens has drawn near."
So John the Baptist had been preaching that exact same message. And John had had run-ins with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and his ministry was cut short when he was arrested, jailed, and ultimately executed by Herod Antipas. Now, John had baptized Jesus, and the passage that Kevin read occurs right after Jesus had returned from the temptation in the wilderness. Jesus sets out on his ministries, and then the Gospels of both Matthew and Mark have this as the next event.
Matthew 4:18 through 22. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. They were fishermen and were casting nets into the sea. "Follow me," said Jesus. "I'll make you fish for people." Straightway they abandoned their nets and followed him. He went on further and saw two brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. They were in the boat, mending their nets with Zebedee, their father. He called them. At once they left the boat and their father and followed him.
So the first act that Matthew and Mark show Jesus doing is calling four people who will be close to him for the rest of his life on earth and who will be important parts of the speed, flow, and direction of the Jesus movement after the day of Pentecost. Peter and Andrew, James and John were two sets of brothers, all fishers. The fact that Peter, Andrew, James, and John are fishers is quite well known, but what did it mean to be a fisher in the first century? First century fishers were probably the best approximation of a modest middle class. They were small business owners that organized themselves through their extended families. They were not poor, nor were they hired labor. In fact, fishers employed hired labor. In the telling of this event in Mark 1:20, the author notes that James and John left their father in the boat with the hired hands. Fishers owned their own means of economic production, boats, nets, and other infrastructure that it took to fish. Most of that would have been sourced outside of Judea and would have required the means and connections to acquire them. In Roman-occupied Judea, fishing was heavily regulated and heavily taxed. As much as 1/2 of the catch could be paid as tax. And while it's not clear the extent to which fishers would have been educated, the regulation in the fishing industry meant that they would have needed to be literate at a minimum. These were people living a relatively comfortable life in all the circumstances. And at first blush, their occupation seems to serve mainly as a basis for the fishermen, fishers of men wordplay. Which brings us to the next member of Jesus' circle of friends.
Matthew 9:9 and 10. And passing on from there, Jesus saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collection house, and says to him, "Follow me." And rising, he followed him. And it happened that, as he was reclining at a table in the house, look, many tax collectors and sinners came and reclined at a table with Jesus and his disciples.
So here we have Matthew or Levi, the tax collector. He's a Jew, but as a tax collector, he's a traitor to his people. He's collaborated with Rome to enforce an oppressive, exploitive system of taxation. There was no civil service at that time. Tax collectors didn't get paid by Rome to collect taxes. Instead, they made their money by collecting more money from the people than the taxes that they actually owed, or by loaning people the money to pay their taxes and then charging usurious interest rates. The tax collector was the archetype of imperial corruption among the Jews. He was an outsider who was scorned with a certain justification. And we're going to see he was named as one of the 12.
Luke 6:12 through 17. Now it happened that in those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he summoned his disciples and chose 12 from among them, whom he also named apostles: Simon, who he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus and Simon, the one called Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who turned traitor. And descended with them, he stood on a level place, along with a large crowd of his disciples, and a great multitude of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and the coastal country of Tyre and Sidon.
So Jesus names the 12 just before giving the Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's shorter version of the Sermon on the Mount. One thing that's important to note here is that Jesus did not only have 12 disciples. It says Jesus had a large crowd of disciples, and it's the 12 who have been chosen from that to be, if you will, his inner council, his closest friends. And as a little interpretive exercise, I encourage you, when you find yourself reading the Gospels, to pay attention who it is that Jesus is speaking to, because sometimes it's the 12, and it will say the 12, and sometimes it's his disciples, which is this larger group. Sometimes it's the crowds, sometimes it's the religious leaders. And I think that it's important in understanding who Jesus is speaking to understand how to interpret and apply what it is that he's saying. Now, in listing the 12, we're not given a lot of detail about these people. But this passage does give us some interesting insight into the background of Simon the Zealot and possibly Judas Iscariot. The Zealots were well, depending on where you come from, some would call them freedom fighters. The Romans would have called them terrorists. They sought to bring about the kingdom of God by the violent overthrow of Rome. They were trying to incite rebellion amongst the Jewish people. They hated anyone who collaborated with Rome or sought any kind of peace with Rome. And the Zealots ultimately succeeded in fomenting the rebellion that resulted in the First Jewish-Roman War between 66 and 73 CE, which saw the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Ultimately, the Zealots died by suicide at Masada rather than surrendering to Rome. Among the Zealots was an extremist splinter group called the Sicarii that were named for small daggers that they secreted in their cloaks. They went into crowds and stabbed Romans and Roman sympathizers, and then were able to hide their weapon and blend into the crowd. And there are theories that there's been a lot of controversy about what Iscariot means in Judas Iscariot. And one of the theories is that Iscariot signals that Judas was a member of the Iscariot. So we know that at least one and possibly two of the 12 that Jesus chose to be in his inner circle were violent revolutionaries. And so if this group weren't unlikely enough in the context of Roman occupied Palestine, Luke tells us that there were women.
Luke 8, 1 through 3. Soon afterwards, Jesus went about in person with the 12 through the towns and villages, announcing and telling the good news of God's kingdom. They were accompanied by various women who had been healed from evil spirits and diseases. Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others. They looked after the needs of Jesus and his companions out of their own pockets.
So note that the people with Jesus in this passage are specifically the 12, rather than all of the disciples writ large. And with them are these various women. And they are all women of means who are actually footing the bill for Jesus and the 12. And we've got 3 that are of them that are named specifically. The first is Mary Magdalene, and that name is likely familiar to you, but probably not for the right reasons. There is actually no biblical support for the notion that Mary Magdalene had been a sexually immoral woman or a sex trade worker. It was actually Pope Gregory the Great, or not so great, that asserted this in the 6th century, and it just grew from there. By calling her Mary Magdalene, Magdalene meant of Magdala, which was a village on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The inclusion of the town of origin in someone's name indicates that they are prominent and respected in that town. And the fact that she had resources, but there's no mention of a husband, means that it's likely that she was a widow, and to have wealth and security, an older widow. The text says that 7 demons had gone out of Mary Magdalene, which is also part of the reason for drawing her in a negative context, but frequently that there isn't an understanding at this time about a lot of disease. And so demons are added to it. But what I think is important is that the number 7 there, which is a number of completeness or wholeness. And I think it's possible, though this is just my own speculation, that she had a disease with broad systemic effects that she had been healed from. And frankly, I think it could be the symptoms of menopause. Mary Magdalene would be the first person to see the risen Jesus. And there is a Gnostic Gospel of Mary that says she became one of the most powerful leaders in the early Jesus movement. So we have what's likely a rich widow, a rich independent widow. Now we have Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. So here we have a woman who is politically well-positioned and connected, but connected to the Jewish collaboration with the Roman oppressors. Herod Antipas was a puppet king for Rome, and he ruled in Galilee. Joanna's husband managed Herod's household. It is speculated that when John was imprisoned at the palace, that he had influenced Joanna and her husband, because she has now left her husband and the halls of Galilean power to travel with and finance Jesus's ministry. And so the fact that her husband would have had access to power to be able to stop her indicates that she had his support. And Joanna would be with Mary Magdalene at the tomb on Easter morning. The third is Susanna. We don't really know anything about her other than her name. There is a theory that Luke named these three women because they were well known to the original audience, and he wanted to signal that they assisted him with eyewitness accounts from Jesus's life. And finally, we have Paul.
Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. But Saul, still snorting out menaces and slaughter at the Lord's disciples, approaching the chief priest, requested letters from him to Damascus for the synagogues, so that if he discovered any persons belonging to the way, he might lead them in bonds to Jerusalem, men and women alike. Now, as he journeyed, it happened that he drew near Damascus, and suddenly a light from the sky, and falling upon the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he said, "Lord, who are you?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you persecute. It is hard for you to kick against the prods." And trembling and amazed, he said, "Lord, do what you will that I should do." And the Lord said to him, "Arise, however, go into the city, and you will be told what it is necessary to do."
Now, it isn't until Jesus has died, been resurrected, and ascended that we see him calling anybody with what might be considered religious pedigree or theological chops. Paul was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were not the religious ruling class, but actually progressive intellectual teachers and religious activists. He lived in the diaspora rather than in Judea, in Tarsus, a Hellenistic city under Roman control, and somehow he was a Roman citizen. Paul was quite different from the diverse group that Jesus had already gathered. So what do we see when we look at this group together? First, this seems very intentional. The Bible lacks a lot of the details that we might want to know. So when details are included, they're usually there to tell us something. Jesus could have started his ministry by infiltrating a religious group within Judaism and then drawn like-minded people, read men, into a subsect. Instead, he seems to go out of his way to amass a diverse group of people who would not otherwise find themselves together. Second, each one of these people left their lives behind to follow Jesus. These wildly different people all had this wild thing in common. Third, Jesus's teaching didn't particularly align with any of them. Jesus reached out to and included the marginalized tax collector and Roman collaborator, but Jesus clearly denounced all abuses of power and exploitation among his followers. While he saw the kingdom of heaven displacing oppressive imperial regimes, he was not amassing a rebel army to evict the Roman occupiers the way the Zealots wanted to see. And he wasn't looking to set up an earthly government with the cushy cabinet positions that the fishers wanted. So what in all of this can we glean about the practice of unlikely friendship? At this point, I'd like to make a caveat. This is not a love your enemies sermon, though surprisingly, that happens to be our topic for Bible study this week on Thursday night, if anyone is interested. Nor is this a reconciliation sermon. I could certainly not do any more or better than what Jordan did last week. And while both of those practices are important and indeed indispensable for followers of Jesus and those seeking a more just society, unlikely friendship is not a watertight compartment, but introducing it into a situation where there has been abuse of power or other injustice requires extra wisdom. Friendships, likely or otherwise, should be based on mutuality, mutual affection, mutual esteem, and mutual respect. Not perfectly, but not abusive, oppressive, or parasitic, and certainly not tokenistic. That said, any friendship brings a risk of harm. Even the likeliest friends can end up hurting you. In his treatise on ethics, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote the following about friendship. It is the soul of a friendly world. No free and just society will come into being without the ethics and wisdom of friendship. Friendship links personal freedom with social solidarity. I believe that unlikely friendships are based in seeing the image of God in everyone. I, and whatever group I identify with, am no more or less the image of God than you and whatever group you identify with. Unlikely friendships focus on the humanity that we have in common rather than our differences. Unlikely friendships require us to step out of our comfort zones and go into each other's spaces, and to create space where everyone can be their authentic self. One of the articles I read this week questioned whether an unlikely friendship that occurs solely in one of the friend's spaces and not in the other friend's space could be friendship at all. Where friendships focus on dialogue rather than debate, people can step outside of their echo chamber and be affected by other points of view. Unlikely friendships foster empathy and create space for grace and mercy. So how do you foster unlikely friendships? I don't recommend you trying to summon Jesus's gravitas and walk up to strangers and saying, "You, come with me." Unlikely friends are still friends. The relationship is based on affection. It is being purposeful in not limiting that affection to the people who are most like you, but in seeing the humanity in the people that God has placed around you. Within the first few months that we attended Open Way, Sonia preached an incredible sermon out of the book of Numbers. It was just awesome. And Kevin and I both looked at each other after the sermon and said, we want to hang out with them. And so I thought, well, we're supposed to practice unlikely friendship at this new church I found. So we invited Sonia and Lori to a Zoom hang. Back in the days of COVID, where we probably did that for 6 months or so before we ever saw one another in person. And they have become, Sonia and Lori have become some of our best and most loyal friends, even with the transition of Kevin and I moving up to Whitehorse. Jesus was intentional. Be intentional. Build bridges to people who are different than you. You can do this by looking for ways to serve and care for the people around you. Practice hospitality. Listen. Unlikely friendships may be the most joyous, subversive revolution you've ever been a part of. Thank you.
Kim, thank you so much. I learned